Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see all of you on time as usual during during the daily lunchtime devotion. Today, being with Jesus reading, we come to so-called the last part of 2 Timothy. Okay, so our title today, sharing as the final encouragement. Now, if you read yesterday's passage, especially 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 6 to verse 8, I think it gives us a clue of what is going through Paul's mind as he so-called reached the end of writing the letter to Timothy, because it is very clearly, there's a reason why he said, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith, I have fought the good fight. Because clearly it is in his mind, his departure is near, meaning that this is his farewell letter to Timothy. And yet, in the midst of this, he still ended the letter with what I call today the final encouragement to Timothy. Now let's just do a recap again, about these so-called pastoral letters. So the two letters to Timothy and then letter to Titus is what we commonly call the pastoral letters. It is commonly so-called acknowledged. They are addressed to leaders, not just pastors, leaders in so-called the gospel ministry. And from there, we read, the admonishment, warnings, instructions, even exhortations given to Timothy. And Paul emphasized a lot on sound doctrine and heresy. In my previous sharing, I talk about the heresy, and it's about Gnosticism, it's about asceticism, it's about the Judaizers, so all kinds of heresy started to infiltrate the church. But Paul kept on reminding Timothy, or even Titus, they need to show exemplary conduct if they want to be servant or leaders of God. But then, even today, when we read these three pastoral letters, it is very relevant for Christians like us. So I listed down some of the so-called learning points or applications. Okay, we read about true and false teachings in 1 Timothy. We talk about Jesus as the only savior for everyone. 1 Timothy again. We can read about conduct and responsibilities, personal gain and money. Last week I shared about 1 Timothy chapter 6. We talk about unashamed, of Jesus, being a Jesus followers and of the gospel. We read about priority of discipleship. And yesterday's reading in the first part of chapter 4, we read about scriptures, the effectiveness of scriptures in training, rebuking, and lastly, endurance. So today's reading is from verse 9 onwards. Okay, this is what I called it earlier, Paul's final encouragement for Timothy. And as I alluded to earlier, this Paul, he sensed or he knew he has come to the end of his journey in this world. And if you read the Bible, it didn't mention what happened to the Apostle Paul. But historian or even the church traditions, many hold the belief that he was found guilty at Rome in the tribunal and he was beheaded. And he died as a martyr for the faith. He's beheaded because he's a Roman citizen instead of crucifixions, which is what Peter's have to go through. So in this final part, verse 9 onwards to verse 22, what John Piper said, there is sweetness in sadness. There is sweetness in sadness, even as he bid farewell to Timothy. And we can read, through the writings, through these few verses, Paul is very honest, he's very transparent, and he showed his vulnerability, and he poured out his most, deepest and inner thoughts about his discouragement and his pleasure of what, he has encountered. Because we read even, up to now, the persecutions and the hardship that he has endured, because he wants to proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles, because that is his mission. So sometimes some of this hardship, it could be due to external factors, or it could be due to people. So we're going to go through some of the people that has so-called abandoned or hurt Paul. And yet we can take so-called the applications, or we can take it from Paul, or we can be comforted by Paul, because he declared in today's reading, "But the Lord stood at my side and gave me strength." Imagine a person that has gone through all the hardship, all the persecutions, all the beatings, all kinds of so-called hurdles, and yet he can declare boldly and loudly, "The Lord stood at my side and gave me strength." Paul's appeal to Timothy, from verse 9 onwards, we can read, "Many have left him when he is in prison in Rome, and only Luke stayed on." There are a few names mentioned. I just listed down three. One is Demas. Okay, Demas abandoned and left Paul. He has a very sad ending. We'll come to that later on. There's another person by the name of, I think I can pronounce properly, is Crescens. He probably parted with Paul, but on a good terms. Not much was said about why he left. Then there is Titus. Okay, Titus left Paul because he has a purpose. He has a ministry purpose, and hence, at the end, Paul wrote the letter Titus to him when he is, in a sense, pastor of a church. Paul's appeal to Timothy, verse 9, "Do your best to come to me quickly." It is an urgent appeal from Paul as he is looking forward to companionship. Remember, we read earlier, he said that he is alone except Luke. So in verse 16, somewhere down there, we read, "At my first defense," meaning that at his first defense in Rome, "no one came to my support, but everyone deserted me." His appeal to Timothy, not just as a friend, not just as like a mentor and mentee, because he found true companionship with Timothy. That is the relationship that he has built up with Timothy. And he asks Timothy to bring along his personal belongings, his cloak or his clothes, the scrolls or the books or the parchments. And that signifies the deep relationship and trust between two of them. Paul's appeal to Timothy is a reminder to us, we need our so-called brother in arms, meaning fellow Christians and believers whom we can depend on, or vice versa, when we are in need, both spiritual and physical needs. That is a lesson that we can draw from Paul when he appealed to Timothy, because the relationship and the trust wasn't built over a short time. They must have, in a sense, journey along, so that Paul can make that final and personal appeal to Timothy. Paul also gave warning to Timothy to brace yourself for betrayal by trusted associates. So earlier we read about Demas. Who is Demas? Okay, Demas is Paul's co-workers, or what we call today associates in ministry, partners in ministry. He was mentioned in Philemon, verse 1, chapter 1, verse 24, and so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. His name appears in Colossians as well. Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send greetings. Verse 9 said clearly why Demas left and abandoned Paul in his ministry. Because he loves the things of this life, NLT version. Because he loves the world. And what happened to those who love the world? We can read from 1 John chapter 2, verse 15. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. So it's very obvious the reason why Paul is upset or disappointed, because for once Demas was with him. Demas was a co-worker. Demas was fired up with the gospel. But the love of the world, the things of the world, has pulled him away. So what we can learn again from so-called warning given by Paul to Timothy, that many of us, myself, all of us, and even people that we know, that we may once stood up for Christ. We may once proclaim Jesus as our Savior. We may once to be a fervent servant of God and champion for the gospel. But be careful. The love of the things of the life of the world can pull us away, and we can abandon the gospel for the sake of temporary pleasure of this world. This is a warning which we need to take seriously. This is also, like I say, we need to brace for so-called betrayal sometimes by people that, in a sense, walking together with us in the Christian faith. That is the story about Demas. Paul also continued to encourage Timothy, be prepared to be helped by what I call the failed one. Who is this failed one? It is none other than John Mark, the famous person who caused Paul and Barnabas parted ways after the first mission trip. So John Mark, from being a failure to a helper to Paul, which is quite amazing. We read earlier in Acts chapter 15, John Mark left Paul and Barnabas. One of the reasons could be he is very discouraged due to it is fruitless, in the ministry. So in Acts chapter 15, we can read he had deserted them and had not continued with them in the work. But fast forward, when we come to 2 Timothy chapter 4, we can see acceptance by Paul and the great trust and so-called importance now, John Mark, for Paul, because in verse 11, Paul wrote, because he, John Mark, is helpful to me in my ministry. In a sense, John Mark, after his first so-called failure, he has matured in faith and he has been faithfully serving God till the point Paul said that he is helpful to me, and not only that, John Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark. It is a reminder to us many a times that we shouldn't or we do not write off people easily just because of one or two failures. By God's grace, everyone can be used by God mightily. That is a great encouragement to Timothy and to ourselves, even for today. Paul continued to teach, or in a sense, advise Timothy the wisdom of handling hurts or wounds. A name is mentioned, Alexander the coppersmith. Now, Alexander possibly could be the same person mentioned in 1 Timothy chapter 20, when Paul wrote, among them are Hymenaeus, and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan to be taught not to blaspheme. Now that is a very strong word there. So apparently Alexander, had done Paul a great deal of harm, and he strongly opposed the gospel. Okay, bear in mind, these are people who once followed Jesus, who once, in a sense, followed the way. And we can deduce from the writings by, the Paul's writing, that the hurt must be so painful. Okay, but Paul, he wasn't bitter. Paul's advice to Timothy, okay, if you deal with such kind of person, if you face such kind of person, do not seek revenge. Be careful, but exhibit forgiveness. In verse 16, may it not be held against them. To exhibit forgiveness to those who hurt Timothy. Paul is following Jesus' example. It's not surrounded. He surrendered. Sorry, there's a typo error there. He surrendered those who failed him to God, who shall judge according to his plan. He surrendered those who failed him to God, who shall judge according to God's plan. As he wrote in verse 14, the Lord will repay him, Alexander, for what he has done. And it is also mentioned in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 30, for we know him who said, it is mine to avenge, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. So it's a very great advice, or I will say wisdom, on handling people who hurt us. We exhibit forgiveness, but the Lord ultimately will be the judge, and the Lord will repay those, who has, in a sense, trespassed against us or against the church. The last part, Paul wrote about God is our deliverer, verse 17 to verse 18. But the Lord stood at my side and gave me strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. And I was delivered from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. Just through these two verses, Paul knew his master's presence when no one came to his support. He mentioned this earlier in verse 16. And Paul knew his source of strength. Paul knew his calling and his purpose. As he said, the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. And Paul knew his escape from being thrown to lion's den. Okay, a lot of people just assume it's a lion's den. Okay, but probably not for Roman citizens. It's more for non-Roman citizens. They'll be thrown, to the lion's den. But it's basically a death penalty. Probably he escaped during his first trial, meaning that the verdict is inconclusive. But he said that only God can deliver him from so-called the final so-called verdict, which is death penalty. And it can only be God's work. And lastly, Paul knew God's assurance on his temporary predicaments. Okay, because last part of verse 18, God will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. So in a very short so-called passage, Paul, it told us about what is his deep conviction about his relationship with God. that God is everywhere, even though when nobody came to his support. And he stick to his calling, even though he may be thrown into lion's den, but he knew that God will rescue him. Even so, as we said earlier, this is his farewell letter. He knew where he is heading to when he is leaving this world. I just listed down a few points to ponder for us. See, Paul wrote this conclusion, this heartfelt conclusion, what John Piper said earlier, sweetness in sadness. He knew fully well his time is up on this world. So for all of us, consider below, just like Paul, who is God to us? Who is Jesus to us? What is our calling and purpose when we are on this world? Who has delivered us from loneliness, from our trials and sufferings? And what does our future hold? If we have answered that it is God, like what Paul has mentioned many times, how do we then make God known to those in need of him in the same situation like us? But needless to say, Paul, he is very certain of all these questions. And he has said many, many times throughout the gospel, to him, to God, be glory forever and ever. I will end today's devotion. In a sense, I said earlier, this is the final letter written by Paul. And we can see the emotions that contain in this letter. All of us will leave this world soon. All of us has a purpose in this world. Let us be encouraged by Paul as his final encouragement to Timothy. God will be there, but first we also need to know what is our calling, what is our purpose. And if we know our calling and purpose, we need to make God known to those surrounding us.